All right, we are at 3 p.m., so I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Raven Chandler. I'm the director of the Pennsylvania Population Network at Penn State University, and I'm very excited to moderate this session today. So this is ADC1, Internal and International Migration in the Time of and Following COVID-19. As I mentioned previously, if you were in the room, our first presenter, Xuexing Wang, is not able to be with us today, so we have two presenters, and we're going to start in order. Julien Berard-Chagnon is going to be giving us his talk here on adjusting Canada's estimates of returning emigration in the context of COVID-19 using new administrative data. And I'm just going to say before we get started, I have a couple things I'm supposed to share with you today. Welcome, obviously, but if you have questions, please place them in the chat box and I will help to facilitate those. And then if you are of the social media Twitter using folks, we're using hashtag ADC2021 to discuss these sessions. So if you're into that, please share information. And then I'm going to turn it over to Julien.
Okay, hello everyone. I will share my screen presentation. Okay, so my name is Julien Berard-Chagnon. I'm a senior demographer in the Center for Demography at Statistics Canada. And today I will discuss how we adjusted one of our components of international migration in the context of COVID-19 using new admin data. Okay, so context first, StatCan releases quarterly preliminary estimates of population 3 months after the end of the reference period. This means that right now we have estimates as far as October 1st, 2020, publicly available for population as well as component of demographic growth. So we always release preliminary estimate and then later on we update them when new data comes available. So it's our trade-off between accuracy and timeliness. As we all know, something happened in 2020. So the pandemic strongly impacted international migration flows. So there were travel restrictions at borders all around the world that led to a marked decrease in the number of international flights and border crossings. And also many governments, including Canada's, appealed to their citizens abroad to ask them to return home as fast as possible. So usually we have demographic models to measure the components of growth. But in this context, our models were far less appropriate. So as a result, StatCan adjusted some of its model to take into account the current context. So I quickly introduce our concepts of international migration for flows. So we have 5 components of demographic growth related to international migration. First, we have immigrants. So they are similar to green card holders. So they have been granted the permanent permit to live in Canada. Then we have net non-permanent residents, which are foreign workers and international students who are granted the right to live in Canada on a temporary basis. Asylum seekers are also in this category. We have immigrant, so people leaving the country. Then a subset of immigrants, which will be the topic of my talk, is returning immigrants. So I'll define them more precisely in the next slide. And our final component is net temporary immigration. So which is people who leave the country on a temporary basis, for example, to study abroad and then return to Canada. Okay. So as I said, the focus of my talk will be on returning immigration. So these are defined as Canadian citizens or immigrants having previously immigrated and then who return to Canada to establish a permanent residence. So it's a subset of immigration. This excludes temporary residents because we consider them in another component. So from a US perspective, I think they can be seen as US-born immigration plus a little bit of foreign-born immigration if these foreign-born left the United States and then came back. So it's a relatively small component of growth. But from our perspective, the few studies we have suggest that 8% of the number of Canadian citizens are residing abroad. So there's still a sizable potential pool of return immigrants around the world. Also, during last spring, this population group it was raised in the media that many Canadians could return, and there were debates about should they be eligible to get COVID special programs, what about the housing market? So they raised the attention in the media. Okay, so what's the issue? So in normal times, returning immigration is mostly estimated using data from the Canada Child Benefit. So every month, parents of young children get checks from the government to help them raise their kid. So if they return to the country, they appear on the file. So we consider them to be returning immigrants. We have information that they were in Canada before. So the file is very current, but it's not complete enough to be usable very fast. So we use rates that are 2 years old to compute preliminary estimates of returning immigration. So for example, the 2018-2019 estimates were computed using rates from 2016-2017. Of course, later, we update the estimates, and the final estimates use the proper time period from the CCB data. So the key assumption of this approach is that recent trends are similar to those of the latest data available, which, of course, given the pandemic, is less true. So not only the level of returning immigration very likely changed, but also the profile of international travelers. So as a result, we needed to adjust our model to consider the pandemic. So we needed data that are very current, responsive, conceptually appropriate, and that cover the right universe. So there's not a lot of sources available even right now. So after doing a thorough review of the sources at our disposal, including international sources, we ended up devising an adjustment using 2 new sources. So our adjustment used flight data as the baseline that are complemented by data from our usual model and by travelers' data. So in a nutshell, the adjustment is done in 3 steps. So first, we derive a potential number of returning immigrants using flight data. Of course, on a plane, not everybody is a migrant. Most of them are visitors. So we have to find a way to identify these migrants among this large pool of visitors. This leads us to the second step, where in order to fill the gap between travelers and flight data and returning immigrants, we adjust the level of potential migrants by comparing them with what our usual model gives us. And then, since we have strong reasons to believe that the profile of international travelers changed during the pandemic, we made an adjustment using travelers' data. So the next slides will detail each of these steps. So the adjustments were implemented beginning in March 2020, which corresponds to the month where most travel restrictions were put in place. Okay, so first step is to get a number of potential returning immigrants using flight data. So we use the flight data we use is called primary inspection kiosk. So when you land in a major Canadian airport, such as Toronto, Montreal, Ottawa, etc., we collect your declaration using these fancy new electronic kiosks. So they replace filling a piece of paper which you declare your information. They are managed by the Canada Border Services Agency. So this data is very, very current. Microdata is available, and we also have information on citizenship and country of residence. A limit of this data is that it's very recent. The program began in 2018, so we don't have a lot of data to build a model on. It does not include all border crossings. It's only air crossing in major airports. And we don't know the intention of residents in Canada and the duration of the time abroad. So we know that a migration is a change in the country of residence. So we know that our concept is based on Canadian citizens. So we use a PIC data and we define potential returning immigrants as Canadian citizens who reported residing abroad when they landed in a Canadian airport. So, of course, this pool of potential migrants includes migrants, but it also includes visitors to Canada, such as someone who's visiting relatives or attending a conference. So this is why we have other steps to take this into account. So the good thing is that by using this data, we can flag on our pool of Canadians abroad by looking at the information of Canadians residing abroad only, so that we can exclude easily Canadian residents who are flying to the south for 1 week during winter or any other trips like this. So this is the numbers on PIC potential returning immigrants. So this is for 2018. So we see there is a peak in July, which corresponds to the months of migration and also to vacation, so that people can come back to visit their relatives who stayed in Canada. We also see a second peak in December, which corresponds to the Christmas period. 2019, we see almost same numbers. And things get interesting when we look at 2020. This is what we get. So January, February numbers are similar to those of 2018 and 2019. And then we see beginning in March, we see a drop in the number of potential returning immigrants. And then we see that from April to December, numbers are a lot lower than they used to be in the past. So this suggests that there were fewer returning immigrants in the country. Okay, so then, as I said, PIC data contains migrants and visitors. StatCan only wants migrants for the purposes of demographic estimates. So we need to find a way to flag migrants among these pools of travelers. So also there are inconsistencies from between universes and coverage. So the second step is to use this potential pool of migrants and to reconcile the numbers with those of the demographic estimates. So we apply the simple monthly rates. So we compute the difference between our usual model and PIC data by month for the 2 years in which we have data from both sources, 2018 and 2019. And we apply this ratio to PIC data beginning in March. The key assumption behind this approach is that the relationship between PIC data and our usual model is constant. However, this is very probably flawed because we have strong reasons to believe that the profile of international travelers changed during the crisis. So people coming back to Canada on a plane are probably more likely to be returning immigrants than visitors to the country, given the mandatory quarantine you have to do when you land in the country, given that many conferences were canceled or held virtually, etc., etc. So in our second step, this graph shows the numbers of PIC potential returning immigrants that I just showed and compare them with our estimates of returning immigrants, which are our goal. So the PIC data I showed you, and then our usual model. So we see the numbers of returning immigrants the orange bar is a lot lower than that of potential returning immigrants. Of course, the blue line, the PIC, they include visitors. So it makes sense that numbers are a lot higher. So for example, in a given month, PIC gives us between 20,000 to 70,000 potential returning immigrants. And our usual model suggests that there are between 5 and to 20,000 returning immigrants in Canada by month. Okay, so this graph will show what our adjustment looks like after the first two steps. So the first step is using our potential returning immigrants. The third time I show this line. So beginning in March, a strong decrease that stayed during the whole summer. And when we adjust this PIC data with our estimates, we get this. So we get a very small number of returning immigrants, even in March. This does not truly correspond to what we believe happened. This is what we added a third step to take this into account. Okay, so our third step is to adjust for the change in the profile of returning immigrants. So as I said, the pandemic likely changed the
Julian, is it possible you might have hit your microphone button on accident? We're having a little difficulty hearing you.
Okay, yeah, I think I must have hit the button. Okay, do you hear me now?
I can hear you. Would you mind maybe just backing up about maybe 2 to 3 minutes on what you're talking about on this slide, please?
On this slide?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So after the two first steps, we calibrated the PIC data on our estimates of returning immigration. In PIC data, we have visitors as well as migrants. So we need to flag migrants among this large pool of travelers landing in airports. So, but because of the pandemic, we strongly assume that the profile of international travelers changed. So given that conferences were canceled, that there's a mandatory quarantine when you land in the country. So we feel that in any given plane, there's relatively more returning immigrants now than in the past. So to take this into account, we use data from the registration of Canadians abroad, which is a free service for citizens through which the government notifies its national in case of emergencies. So it's managed by Global Affairs Canada. So it's very easy to register. I do every time I travel abroad. It gives us some basic information such as dates of registration, departure, and return, as well as country of destination. Very timely. And we have, as I said, we have some basic characteristics that are relevant here. The main drawback of ROCA data is that coverage is very low. So we have small numbers, so more volatility, and it's slightly biased towards people traveling in certain given countries where situation is less stable. Also, coverage probably changed with the pandemic as people are more cautious when they travel abroad. So with this data, we define a returning immigrant as being someone who returned to Canada after a trip of at least 1 year abroad, if they registered before departure. So the key assumption here is that the date of return that they put in the system is their date of migration. So if they put that they would return on May 2018, it's not for 1 week to visit their relatives. It is because they are moving back to Canada after being abroad for more than 1 year. This allows us to divide between travelers and migrants, and using only people who were registered before leaving also allows us to consider the increase in coverage that happened because of the pandemic. The adjustment, well, we tinkered with a lot of approaches here. So we had to reconcile theoretical considerations and pragmatic implementation. So we use ROCA the following way. So we made a ratio between ROCA returning immigrants and PIC potential returning immigrants by month and year for 2 years, since PIC is very recent. And then we compute the change in the ratio from 2020 compared with that of the 2 previous years. So if the ratio is higher than 1, it means that there were relatively more migrants in 2020 than in the 2 previous years. This is what we see in the data too, so it makes sense. And then we apply this change factor to the peak data that we got after step 2. So going back, okay, so these are the numbers of individuals registered in ROCA before departure. So we see 2018. So we see the numbers from 1 month to the other. It might be like 250 people a month, so it's not a lot. We see an increase in August 2018, and we have no idea as to why. Even the ROCA people don't know. It's part of the limit of the data. And then 2019, still we see the overall relatively same numbers. And then 2020, we see a marked increase in March and to a lesser extent in April, then a strong drop. So this makes sense from our knowledge of what has happened last spring and last summer. Okay, so if we incorporate these ROCA data in our adjustment, we get this. So the first step I showed you, I think it's the 4th time I showed this to you. Then when we adjust with our demographic estimate, and then when we include the ROCA data to take into account the change in profile in travel, we see that in March and April, we had relatively high numbers of returning immigrants, and then numbers were, beginning in May, they were very, very low. This is what we think happened. So it makes sense overall to see this pattern. So if we compare with the last 2 years, we get this. So 2018 and 2019, this is our monthly distribution of returning immigration. We see the numbers are super close because we use past rates. So only population make this change, these estimates change. And then if we add 2020, we see this strong increase in March and April, then lower numbers beginning in May. So this all makes sense according to us. Okay, so recapping the adjustment, a 3-step approach. We use very timely data, peak data, to get the potential number of returning immigrants. Then we adjust this number with our usual model. We calibrate it to our usual model to reconcile the two as best as we can. And because we feel that the pandemic changed the profile in international travel, we add a second adjustment using ROCA data. So by combining the usual method, PIC and ROCA data, we can optimize the strength of each data set and reduce its flaws. So the usual method has what we think the right level in normal times. Flaw is timeliness, 2 years lag. PIC data, the main strength is the number of observations we have. The flaw is the concept, migrant and travelers. And ROCA data, its strength is the concept. At least we know how long they were abroad. And the main flaw is the small number of observations. So in our adjustment can be seen as a trade-off between theoretical and practical consideration. So I will go very quickly on these. These are the net international migration numbers from 2020. So 2016 by quarter, we had that. In 2017, 2018, 2019, we saw an increase in international migration in Canada, essentially because of immigration and temporary residents. And then 2020 happened, and we had a lot smaller numbers, and even negative net international migration in the 3rd quarter. So for the first 3 quarters of the year, the 2020 numbers are 12% of those of 2019. Okay, so when we release our data, we published technical supplements that highlight our decision to adjust or not to adjust each component. So this is the link to our document if you are interested to see what we did and what we think about the situation. And in conclusion, so StatCan responded quickly to measure the impact of the pandemic in a very challenging context. We all know that. This pandemic fostered the use of new sources, like the PIC data, the ROCA data, which we never used before. Our preliminary estimates suggest that there was a marked increase last spring, followed by a steep decline in returning immigration. We'll know we have a better picture in 2 years when the final data will become available. And we are continuing to monitoring the situation and its impact on demographic behaviors. And despite all these challenges, We made many gains for the future. We use new sources. We increased partnerships, notably with the U.S. Census Bureau's demographers, which we had several meetings with them. And yeah, so that's it for me. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. I don't know if you saw, but you had a request in the chat box to put the link. So if you want to share that. Our next presenter is Chris Boyd from the University of Minnesota, talking about internal migration and human development during the COVID-19 pandemic. We'll do the second talk and then open it up for questions.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, give me a second to prepare this. Something more than my computer, sorry. I just want to be able to see you well while I present it. I'm not sure what happened here.
We're not sure the way to see what you're presenting as well, at least not in my.
Okay, I just want to see I just want to see the chat. I figured a way, but I'm not sure it's really working right now. Okay, I think I can see, let me try to share. Okay, you should be able to see it now, and I should be able to see the chat too. Okay, can you see my screen?
I can, yes.
Okay, great. So this is a joint work with the colleagues Tania Vasquez and Johanna Giancari from the Institute of Peruvian Studies in Lima, where I used to work before starting my PhD in applied economics at the University of Minnesota. And I am right now a PhD candidate in applied economics, and I'm also a trainee in the population studies at the Minnesota Population Center. And this work started as being part of a consultative group on internal migration in Peru. So there is some data from that where we know from government officials that it's not really in the data we use for this study, and that's why this is more of a study towards developing some policies from a human development viewpoint. So first of all, I want to give you an overview of what was the lockdown in Peru. So at the beginning of the pandemic, although not at the very beginning, the Peruvian government implemented cash transfers for families that were supposed to be the most affected by the pandemic. However, targeting the most affected is very hard in Peru because around 70% of Peruvians work in informal jobs. So they don't pay taxes. They are not really in the government registers. It's hard to identify them as poor or not. And obviously, poor immigrants are overrepresented in this group, especially they are in large cities, and they are usually in informal service activities. And the recipients of conditional cash transfers that have been implemented before the pandemic are usually rural populations, and they have kept receiving the transfers during the pandemic, and they do it through the national bank accounts. But not everyone has or can even have a bank account at the national bank. So this was also another problem, even with some people was assigned to receive these new transfers because of the pandemic. It's been very hard, and some of them that were in their registries have not even received their first transfers till now. So it's a real problem, this lack of accounts. And so again, these recent migrants in cities have probably lost their jobs and services very quickly, and they were not subject to the regular conditional cash transfers. They seem to have been largely excluded also from the new transfers during the pandemic. That's a big issue here. But what have they done to survive during the pandemic? At least what we know from news and reports from the government is that there networks of community assistance, or what we call social capital. And they are soup kitchens that are literally translated to popular diners, or comedores populares if you speak Spanish, and ollas comunes, or common pots. And these are community-based mechanisms that have been there from the early 90s, and in which women are usually the ones who participate in. So here's a couple examples of how they look like now. They are doing this common cooking outdoors, and still it's mainly women doing this for all the women in urban areas. I think as of now it has been, there's a registry and that says that there's more than 15,000 of these places along Peru. And this is what Lima looked at in mid-April, when the migrants started to decide to come back to their regions of origin. So some migrants associations even asked the central government to give them access or give them permit and provide some transportation to go back safely to their regions of origin, but they were ignored and started walking back. And in this picture, you can see very well that police was sent to stop them, but they could not do so. And after this massive return started, the government started implementing some shelters with COVID testing and quarantine for people who wanted to return to their communities of origin, mainly from Lima. And but still, one need to sign up or have some idea that these shelters existed, and it was you had to register online. So it was very hard for a lot of people to even know that these things existed and they could have a chance to go back safely. And even more, what we know is that in other regions of Peru, there are not Lima, there were no shelters implemented. Very few regions had COVID testing for migrants, for returning migrants, and or mandatory quarantines. And actually, what we knew is that at the time, the regional governments didn't want to be in charge of any of these people coming back. And what we knew again from the news is that some of them were even smuggled into trucks transporting food, or simply they just walked to their destinations and nobody stopped them or tested them for COVID. So we really want to know what's going on with this returning migrants specifically, but it's very hard from the data we have. First of all, there's no data for Peru that measures the migration in the short run, internal migration in the short run. So the best we can have for current data is the National Household Surveys, in which, as you were going to see later, there's a very small sample of migrants. So the best we can do is just analyze how much migration changed and then the characteristics of the migrants in 2019 and 2020 in the period from April to June, so we avoid seasonality. And this is what I'm going to show you later. So specifically, recent internal migration is measured by asking, do you live in the same province you lived there 5 years ago? And the province, just for a record, is the second administrative level and the first is region. And for this analysis, we do not include the international migration, again, because it's not in the data. And as you might know, there are a lot of Venezuelan refugees or looking for refugee in Peru. But this survey did not include them. And actually, the National Institute of Statistics, if you're interested, they have an official survey just for Venezuelans. But I'm sure they're doing that this year because the 2020 information was actually collected by phone. So with this very restrictive data is what we work with. So what do we find? What we measure here first, let's step back, is recent migration. So, so we are not only measuring the return migration, as I will show later, there's a decrease in recent migration, but this included not only the return migration, although we assume This is the majority of this decrease. But there's also a lack of new migrants. So those that would have migrated without the pandemic, but did not do that in 2020. And of course, this includes also the percentage of recent internal migration that this does not include migrants that do not come back to the province where they lived 5 years ago. So, so those that are moving to actually other locations. So again, in sum, we're not measuring the return migration only, and like it was the beginning of the pandemic, we still need a migrant registry. So spoiler alert, this is one of the main policy recommendations we have, and or at least a registry that can actually include migrants and allow the poorest of them to benefit from the new government transfers. And so here are some of the numbers. What we find specifically is that the national level of at the national level, internal migration reduced in around 1 percentage point, but this actually means a reduction in almost 23%. And just a quick note here, these stars, of course, are the usual significance levels, and this change is not equivalent to the exact difference here, divided by the number in 2019, because this was calculated with a regression, including fixed effects by province. So that's why you're not going to see exactly the same difference. But, in any case, we thought this was the best way to measure this. And with this method, we find that around 23% of migration reduced in the whole Peru. But of course, the picture is not the same along the country. Metropolitan Lima, by being a very big city, basically, with a lot of informality and where most of the migration migration flows go to, was the one region that that suffered the most, the largest decrease. And in other regions that are usually actually net recipients of migrants, we don't really see a difference there's not a significant increase or decrease in this migration, which we find very interesting. And looking at what we call the urban hierarchy or population size, we see that migration has statistically significantly reduced at all levels, except for small cities, from 20,000 to 49, almost 50,000 inhabitants. And the largest reductions were, of course, in larger cities, which include Lima, and this it seems that it kind of decreases with the size, but these are very large variance in this result. So maybe not exactly like this. Again, we have very little observations for all this. When we look at sex and age, we find that the reduction of migrants happen among men and women. And although you can see the difference is a little bit larger here for women than for men, this is not statistically different. These two numbers, and 19.9 and 24.9, not statistically different. But this, of course, doesn't mean that male and female had been through this pandemic in the same way. What we actually think is female have been more affected, but at the same time, they have had this social networks that I've shared before in the soup kitchens or other types of female-based community networks that could have made them not suffer this return migration as much as men. Yeah, and by age group, the reduction in percentage points, you can see is larger for the group of young people from 18 to 29 years old. But if we see the percentual change, this is actually the same as the average. And there are not significant differences between these numbers. But of course, this is maybe this is different from zero for the elder. It's possible that they didn't move as much as the other ones. Again, there's a lot of variation here, so these numbers can technically be statistically equal to 0 too. So now I'm going to look at the characteristics of those who are internal migrants in 2019 and 2020. And again, the difference is measured in a similar way as in the previous tables with fixed facts. So when we look at the unmet basic needs, what we find is basically the proportion of migrants increases in overcrowded dwellings, as you can see here, although it decreases the percentage of them that are in a house without a bathroom. So what we conclude from here is that this might be one of the things that migrants are doing, that they are getting together in more overcrowded type of housing with a little bit of a better quality of the bathroom in this case. And this is what is allowing them to stay in the places where they are living. So for us, it's very clear that this coming together to live in the same place and avoid being evicted is one of these strategies that migrants are doing. And this is, of course, also related to have a social capital to rely on in the place where they live in. And in terms of high economic dependence, we just think this is part of the trend in the whole country or in the whole world, that high economic dependence increases for everyone. We don't see a drop in the percentage of kids not going to school, but this is also very tricky because Peru had a policy of having every kid passing the school year 2020, and schools were completely closed, but classes were done through the internet, but also through TV and radio. So technically every kid was going to school, although there's no way to know who was learning or what they were learning. So this is, again very tricky. In terms of access to services, we don't really see a difference in what they had with respect to the previous year. So again, the quality of housing might probably be just a little bit better in terms of having a bathroom, but this is overcrowded housing, not really in a better place to live. And what's interesting is that the percentage of people with cell phone increased significantly a little bit. And although this is for some authors, of course, representation of how well connected you are to your network. So this could go in the same direction of the story of the soup kitchens for women. But I think it's also very interesting to think that 99% of migrants now have a cell phone or a household with a cell phone, because this means that this is the good way to reach them. When we look at education levels, it seems like the proportion of education, the distribution of the education of migrants hasn't really changed a lot from 19 to 2020. And it just decreased in terms of those with higher education, which for us, it looks like those migrants with higher education levels in 2019 probably didn't need to be still migrants in 2020, and they probably just came back to their origin places and still kept the job. So they didn't really need to stay in the same place to keep their jobs, or they were probably in a more privileged position compared to the other migrants. And in terms of the labor market, and here is what I find more interesting, is that, of course, I think a big part of the migration happens because of labor opportunities. So with the pandemic, there's this whole uncertainty that comes in terms of labor. And as I mentioned at the beginning, Most of the migrants to cities just come with, the poor migrants, of course, come with nothing, start working in the informal sector in services. And this is actually what was shut down during the lockdown, So when we look at services, of course, the percentage of the economically active population decreased among migrants. But if we look at agriculture, which is a sector that did not stop because of the pandemic, either the great industrial agriculture or the small family agriculture did not stop. And we see that this certainty in the labor market in this sector is actually what seems to be driving the migrants. This is where the migrants seem to be now. So this is a huge increment, and this is the only sector where we find this significant and huge increment in labor activities. So yeah, I think this is pretty interesting, and this tells us a story, or we hypothesize, of course, that this certainty in the labor market that agriculture offers is what's driving this, at least a big part of this migration, while services is more like pushing people, and the uncertainty around the service sector is what's pushing people out of these places. So this is just a summary, more or less what I've said, but I'm just going to quickly say it again. The story we have on who stays and who leaves is basically that given the economic uncertainty in the destination, migrants have two options: either stay or return to the place where they came from. And our analysis shows that labor certainty in agriculture is what keeps migration happening, while uncertainty in labor market, like in the services, informal sector, return migration is more common. And when there is this economic uncertainty, migrants would stay in a few cases if they have state government cash transfers and they actually receive them, because that was also a problem. And if they had the social capital that allowed them to stay alive, basically eating with these soup kitchens, or if basically they had nowhere to go, and even though they have to starve, they don't have anywhere to go, so they just have to stay and try to see a way to live, which is very, very hard. So we wrote this piece from the human development theory perspective. So I will now present some of these related ideas. And first, we need to understand that returning migration is a type of forced migration, in this case, forced by an economic crisis. So the return migration cannot be understood as the human development initial theories that have said that migration is a mechanism through which people exercise the freedom of agency to expand their human capabilities. There are not only these usual costs of migration, like leaving your family behind or the initial cost of transportation, but there's a massive lack or a decrease in opportunities in occupational mobility and so many other things. Like, it's not possible to save. So this is by no means the regular migration enhancing human capabilities. And in the previous analysis, we observed that migrants after the pandemic did not really improve their living conditions. And although we don't have a lot of data on this, we presume also their living conditions like access to good health, including mental health, have also decreased for migrants. So a good thing about the human development theory, however, is that it can give us some ideas about how to approach the situation towards migrants. So first, migrants in poverty, we think, should be included in the policies, and to do so, first, they have to be included in the registries targeting the poor. So migrants are of all types, and there's a big chunk of them that are poor. So they have to be included in the policies targeting the poor. And do not deny them access to benefits like the state aid because of the pandemic due to their place of residence. Because that was also another problem we've seen in the news, people that were assigned these transfers and then they decided to move to other places, and because they didn't have the account, they were assigned to a very specific place to pick up their cash transfer and they couldn't do it anymore. So we are aiming for this to change. Second, the state should provide minimum living standards and human rights for everyone. And for migrants now, this implies, of course, given the state aid, strengthening social capital, and provide them with safe conditions for their return. And I'm glad to say that we've, in almost a year, we've learned improve a little bit more about this. And the current government is actually implementing a second lockdown in a few regions, and including Lima. And they are starting to give some money, not only through transfers, but food through these soup kitchens. And finally, policies for migrants in agriculture, specifically, where more of half of them are right now, should be aware of their labor rights, because we also had a lot of political instability and issues in Peru and riots because of how abusive some of these agro-industrial firms can be in Peru. So the fact that they are employing people doesn't mean that they have to abuse them, of course. So it's very important to be aware of them having their labor rights, not just because being agriculture, but also being migrants. And this is in the case of course, the big agricultural industry. But in terms of the small agriculture, it's also important to think, not only to identify, but to think the migrants, but to think in a broader access to extension services and information programs, including financial education, so they can receive the transfers and use savings and credit to boost family agriculture. And this is, I'm just going to go one more step because I'm also an agricultural economist. I think this assistance to agriculture is also very important to guarantee not only the welfare of these farmers or these internal migrants that are now going to be in family agriculture, but also the internal food supply for most Peruvian families. Otherwise, this chain is going to be broken, and there's going to be a long-term problem from agriculture. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. So I'm going to open it up to questions. I'm not seeing anything in the chat box right now, but we'll give it some time and see if anybody has anything. We have about 20 minutes or so till the session is over. So if anybody has any questions to either of our presenters? In the meantime, I just want to remind everybody that Thursday, tomorrow, the business meeting starts at noon. So definitely attend if you are available. And then just another reminder, I know everybody's saying these in all the sessions, but the PAA annual meeting will be held May 3rd through 5th virtually. So make sure you register. I think the early bird registration is coming up, if my email serves me right, memory there. Well, if no one has any questions for our presenters, I'd like to say thank you again to both of you for being here. Very interesting work. Good luck with everything in the future. You're welcome to hang out. I don't know anything, but otherwise, I'm a big fan of giving people back their time, right? Especially in these
virtual days.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.